Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I have a lot of books to talk to you about today. That's because I am doing my book haul revisit for the month of June, and this is even the edited version of the list. So if you follow along, you know what these are, but basically a book haul revisit is where I look back at June's past. I believe there are 5 of them, and see how many of the books I have read, how many I have unhauled, and start the process of thinking about which books I still want to read at some point and which books I might be ready to unhaul. It's my way of making myself a more accountable reader or book purchaser, because I do think I have learned a lot about how I read, and it's made me more intentional about the books that I actually bring into my library. The idea was taken from All D Books, so credit where it is due. She doesn't do book haul revisits anymore, but I did take the idea from her. I will quickly note, you might be noticing there's a chair there. I got a new chair and I tried to get Teddy to sit in the old chair and he was not interested in that at all. So that chair probably won't be living there much longer if he's not going to be taking the bait. But anyway, quick notes before we get started. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about what these books are about. So if you want to know more about a particular book that we talk about in this video, I will have links to the original book haul videos down below for each year that we cover. Again, there are 5 years that we're going to cover in this video. So go there for more information about these books. And in order to keep this from being really long, I have curated the books that appear. There are circumstances where, like, I collected all of the Sue Grafton books. They're right there on the shelf behind me. I did that to rebuild my collection of her books. It's not the same to me as purchasing a book with the intention of reading it. I was pretty deliberately collecting those books. So I've removed Sue Grafton. I've removed anything I purchased for my Pulitzer Project. I've removed anything that was gifted to me. And I've removed library builders, which are cases where I purchased a book to complete an author collection, etc. And actually, I do have one in here that kind of fits for that, but we'll cover it. I left it in. It's fine. And I also removed anything that I had already read and purchased a copy to have in my library. I'm only including books that I purchased for myself with the intention or hope of reading that book sometime soon. And there are 2 books that I really liked that will not be included here because of those exclusions. One of them is Trespasses by Louise Kennedy, because I had actually listened to it on audio and then I happened to see a used copy at my local used bookstore and I grabbed it. So I had already read it before I brought it into my library, which means it doesn't count based on these metrics. And also The Secret Life of Albert Entwistle by Matt Cain, which is a book that I really love and which a lot of people have read at this point and have also loved. So shout out to that. Actually, it's faced out on my shelf right there. But because it was gifted, it doesn't qualify. So without further ado, because again, I don't want to make this a really long video, let's jump in, because again, there's a lot to cover here. We start with June 2023, and we're going to work our way back in time to June of 2019. Start with the newer ones and go back in time. And as with a lot of other book haul revisits, the most recent one is actually the smallest. That's not always the case, but it does tend to be the case. So there are 3 books that met the criteria for this video from June 2023. The first is This Other Eden by Paul Harding, which I had really been looking forward to last year. I finally got around to reading Tinkers last year as well, and I read This Other Eden. So I had not read a Paul Harding book last year at the time that I hauled this, and now at this time I've read 2. This ultimately was shortlisted for the Booker Prize and was one of the bigger books of last year. So, you know, I am happy to keep it around. Again, Paul Harding is part of the Pulitzer Prize family of authors, and this was just a new release that I was really interested in and wanted to get to for myself. So here it is. I did read it and I enjoyed it. I know people are a little more mixed on it than I was, but I admit I'm a little mixed on it too. Don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, but yes, let's just say it's a success story and go on from there. The next one is Greenland by David Santos Donaldson. This had been recommended to me, and this also has ties to E.M. Forster, so I kind of wanted to do it. Also, I was doing the E.M. Forster read-along last year. I kind of dipped in and out of it, so it felt like it would be really interesting to potentially get to this one. I did not get to it, so I have not gotten to Greenland yet. I would still like to, so it's not going anywhere. So I will keep it on my shelves until I do get to it. This is the one that technically doesn't qualify based on the criteria I've set for myself with these book haul revisits, Saratoga Trunk by Edna Ferber, because I've only actually read one Edna Ferber book so far, and that was Fanny herself, which I absolutely loved, and which set me on this spree where I have been collecting her books. And because I've been collecting her books, technically it doesn't qualify for the metrics that I set for myself, but I'm going to include it. It's fine. You know, these rules are kind of arbitrary and designed to make book hauls revisits a little bit shorter, so I don't spend a whole lot of time. So maybe in the future I'll remove this when it comes to a book haul revisit, but it's here right now. I have not read it yet. I still need to read another Edna Ferber book, and I've been trying to decide if I want to read like Saratoga Trunk or Giant or Showboat before I read her Pulitzer book, which was So Big. I might just jump to So Big. But anyway, I have not read it. I've been collecting her books in anticipation that I'm going to love all of them, and hopefully that will turn out to be the case when I read more, because it's going to be a little embarrassing if it turns out that Fanny herself was a bit of a fluke. So, of the 3 books that qualified for this, one kind of tangentially, I've only read one, and that was This Other Eden, which is 33.3% of the books that I hauled, which is not bad. You know, 1 out of 3, it's okay. It could be better. I have not unhauled any of them, and I don't have plans to unhaul any of them anytime soon. Let's go back to June of 2022, which is a bit bigger, but also includes a lot more unhauls. So in June of 2022, I did a curated book box from a bookstore called Betty's Pages in Michigan. They are a queer-owned bookstore, and I wanted to do I had had a good experience with a curated book box, so I wanted to do another, so I picked a queer-owned store to do it. And a couple of the books in the beginning were things that came from that. First was The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros, which I had actually owned in the past and read a long time ago, and would like to revisit. So I'm holding on to it. I've read it just way in the past, and you know, it's only small, so it should be pretty doable to fit it in at some point, but I haven't reread it yet. So actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm going to have to take a moment and make sure I've done my math correctly at the end, because I have read this in the past, and to me, that counts. Then there was Fruit of the Drunken Tree by Ingrid Rojas Contreras, and it's funny. I had recently unhauled this book at the time that I did the curated book box, and then it ended up back in my library. So I was like, oh, okay, I'll give it a shot. And then, you know, ultimately over a couple of months, I decided, you know, I already unhauled this. Maybe I should just let it go again. And that's ultimately what I did. Then there's Out of Darkness by Ashley Hope Perez, which is a frequently banned book, and I would like to get around to reading it at some point. I have not gotten around to reading it yet. So this is not going anywhere, and hopefully I will be getting around to it. Then there's Aquarium by Yara Shahori. I have not gotten around to reading this yet, but would be interested in it. This was a book that I had not heard of at all when it arrived in that curated book box. So kudos to Betty's Pages for introducing me to a book, and I would still like to get to it, so I'm going to hold on to it and see when. It sounds like a really interesting book. Again, I'm not going to be getting into what these books are about for the purposes of timing, so if you want more, go to the June 2022 book haul, which is linked down below. Then there was Blackout, which is by various authors, and I did read that one. However, I thought it was fine. I didn't feel a need to keep it in my library, so I ended up trading it in at my local used bookstore. Then, The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honoré Fanon Jeffers. I did read this book, and I absolutely loved it. It was my favorite read from last year. I'll link the video where Joel and I talked about our favorite reads from last year in the description box down below, so you can check out the book haul, or you can check out my best books, because this was a huge success story, and it is a huge book, but I would say it's well worth your time. I found it to read very quickly. I actually spoke to Essie at Montana Book Company about this, and she had actually gotten an advanced reader's copy of this book before it even came out, and she still had it, but the size was what had been making her hold off on reading it, and I said, no, it reads really easily and quickly. You really fall into a rhythm with it, and it's beautiful. So she said, well, I'm going to try it. And she did, and she loved it as well. And Essie is probably the person at Montana Book Company who aligns most closely with me as a reader. So I don't know if that's helpful to you or not, but big success story. I read it. I loved it. Then Notes of a Crocodile. This was something that I brought into my library for the LGBTQ+ in translation read-along that I was doing with Jen the Librarian. I didn't manage to fit it in the month in which it was selected for the project, and the reaction to it was very mixed. So I had actually just recently pulled this book off of my shelf and was considering an unhaul. It might very well end up being that, because I have noticed it on my shelf a couple of times over the last year and thought I should catch up to that. And the thing that's always holding me back is that reaction to it was very mixed, mostly negative in the group. So at that point, am I likely to read this or not? I think what I'm going to do is sit down and read a little bit from the opening of the book and just see if it sounds like something I would like to continue. But this is very likely heading to an unhaul. Even though it has a beautiful cover and I had been really looking forward to it, it's just a shame that the reaction to it was so mixed to negative. So we'll see what happens. It's probably heading for an unhaul. Then there are two books that I did already unhaul. Woman of Light by Callie Fajardo-Anstine. I was really getting cramped for space in that part of the alphabet, and I decided that there are audio copies available, and I would be more likely to listen to Woman of Light on audio than I would be to read the physical book. And I just feel like, even at this point, I would be more likely to go back and read Callie Fajardo-Anstine's first book, which was a collection of short stories, than I would be likely to read this novel. So I decided to get rid of it. And then there was Love and Other Disasters by Anita Kelly. I unhauled that one because I actually started to listen to the audio and I only made it about a chapter or a chapter and a half in. And the protagonist was making these awful pratfalls and being clumsy in ways that felt performative and just not great. And I didn't really like the writing of it either. So I didn't feel like I wanted to continue reading it. So it's gone. Looking at the math that I had done, I was actually correct. I did include The House on Mango Street. So I've read 3.5 out of the books I hauled in June of 2022. That's out of 9. So the percentage is 38.9. Not bad, but I've also unhauled 4 of those 9, which is a 44.4% result. And that's not really great either. The bulk of books that I brought into my library that month were also something from a curated book box, though, so kind of a mixed bag on results there. Like, I ended up just thinking Blackout was fine. I do appreciate why they chose it for me. I did appreciate reading it, but I didn't feel like I needed to keep it. And then it's just funny that Fruit of the Drunken Tree was something that I had almost literally just unhauled when it arrived back in my house, and then I just unhauled it again. It is what it is. Let's go back to June of 2021. It's a fair amount of books, but a lot of big books in it. The first of which is Honeybee by Craig Silvey. This is an Australian book that was actually recommended to me by someone. Apparently it has been a little controversial in Australia because it definitely has that portrayal of someone who is transgender and has a very hard life, and people focus on the sort of misery aspect of it and wanting more. So there are some complaints about the portrayal of the protagonist, but the person who recommended it to me said that they actually found it very helpful to them in understanding what it is like to be a transgender person, since they had someone close to them who had recently come out as transgender. So I've held on to it, and I would be curious to read it for myself and see where I land on that spectrum. I had to order it from Australia, so it's not going anywhere, but you know, I don't feel any urgency to get to it anytime quickly, so we'll see. Then there is Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg. I finally got around to reading this last year. I admit I did kind of skim the second half, because talk about books that deal with someone who at the time wouldn't have identified as transgender just based on the year in which this was published, but definitely moves about in gender and has a very gender nonconforming approach to life, and the miseries and pains and abuses that they suffer because of that. And that is the reason I had to put this down for a while and wrap my head around it, get back into a better headspace to read it. So that's kind of what I did. But I kind of skimmed the last part because this is a very intense book. It is an important book. It's a good book, but it is heavy. And again, we don't need to get into it too much, but so I did read it at least. There's that. Then there's Flames by Robbie Arnott, which I got because Joel and I had loved The Rain Heron by Robbie Arnott so much. Joel did read this and was very muted on it. I've heard some much more muted responses to this one compared to The Rain Heron. And for that reason, I feel like the urgency to read this book has pretty well died. At some point, I do want to read another Robbie Arnott. So if in another year or so, this book is still sitting there and I haven't gotten to it, I might start thinking about an unhaul. But in the meantime, it's totally fine just sitting on my shelf and waiting for me to get to another Robbie Arnott book. And we'll see if or when that happens. Then there was Bloom by Kevin Panetta and Savannah Ganichow. This is a graphic novel, a young adult graphic novel, and it was very cute. There is supposed to be a sequel, and I feel like the sequel has kept getting pushed back. I think it's coming out this year. And this is a really cute book, I admit, because it feels a little bit slight, but I am also curious in the sequel. So we'll see what happens. Maybe I'll probably look for the sequel at the library and do it that way. And then I don't feel like I need to keep this book around, but I'm not really crunched for space in my graphic novel section, which is on this shelf behind me. And, you know, maybe that will change if someday I am crunched for space in that area. But for now, I have read it and it will continue to live in my library. And then the final book from the June 2021 book haul was Terms of Endearment by Larry McMurtry. And technically this one doesn't qualify either because Joel actually picked this up for me. So technically it's a gift. June is my birthday month, so it wasn't really a birthday present, but it kind of tied into that. I didn't buy it for myself, but I decided to keep it because I would actually really like to read this. And again, all of the rules are arbitrary. Larry McMurtry is in the Pulitzer family of authors for Lonesome Dove, which I absolutely loved. I just feel like this is a bit more of a library builder because the next book of his that I would be most likely to read would be The Last Picture Show. And then I would expand out and read more, including Terms of Endearment, which seems like a bit of a departure since it is what the movie was based on, if you're wondering. So seems like a big departure from Lonesome Dove and The Last Picture Show and all of those, which would be interesting, I think. So there were 5 books that I brought into my library in June of 2021 that qualify for our purposes here. And again, you could quibble with that a little bit, but who cares? All of these rules are arbitrary. I've read 2 of those 5, which is 40%. Not bad. I'm going to give myself a thumbs up on that. And I have not unhauled any, and I don't really think I'm in danger of unhauling any right now. Flames would be the one that is the closest to an unhaul. But I do still want to read another Robbie Arnott book, so at some point I'll probably try. And it's not going anywhere right now. That takes us to June of 2020, which has a couple of books. First is The Lauras by Sarah Taylor. I have not read this. Part of me has wondered if I'm ever going to get to it at this point, since it's been in my library for 4 years now. But I do really want to get around to reading it. And the reason is that it deals with someone who sort of rejects the notion of gender, I believe. Let's see. Told from the perspective of Alex, a teenager who equates gender identification with unwillingly choosing a side in a war, and then kind of goes from there. So I think that's a really interesting perspective for a novel, and I would like to read it at some point. So ultimately, it's not going to go anywhere. I'm going to hold on to it and hope that I do eventually get around to reading it. Then there were 2 James Baldwin books. The first is The Fire Next Time, which I have not read yet, but it's a tiny little thing. You could dunk it in your coffee. So hopefully I will be getting around to it at some point. I have just navigated to other areas of James Baldwin's work before I've gotten to this one. And I think this one or Another Country will be next. We'll see, but it's not going anywhere for sure. Then there's Go Tell It on the Mountain, which I did read and which I liked. So there's a success story from James Baldwin. Then there was Forced Out, a detective's story of prejudice and resilience. I think in June of 2020, I ended up reading this because in June of 2020, with all of the unrest in the United States and because of, the pandemic, but also all of the protests going on for Black Lives Matter, I did a Pride reading month that centered Black queer stories, and this was one of the stories that I read as part of it. I would recommend it. It's a good book about Kevin Maxwell's experience as a Black police officer in the UK. Nonfiction, obviously, so I would recommend it if you have not read it yourself. The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, which I did end up reading and liking, and now Britt Bennett has been on a Pulitzer jury. She was part of the jury that put forth both Trust and Demon Copperhead, which ended up tying for the prize. So good on Britt Bennett. for recognizing quality, in my opinion. And then the final one for June of 2020 was A Burning, a novel by Megha Majumdar. And I admit my urgency to read this has pretty well died at this point. Too much time has passed. Too many other shiny things have come up in the meantime. When I do mention it, I think the last time I mentioned it was in a book I'll revisit, a couple of people commented to say that they liked it and they think I might like it. So that is what has kept it here. But I admit I just don't feel much urgency to get to it anymore. Too much time has passed. Too many other things have come along. So I'm going to hold on to it and hope that the urgency comes back. But this also has a very distinctive spine, so I do notice it on my shelf, and I really haven't felt an urge. Like I mentioned, Notes on a Crocodile, I have seen it on the shelf and thought I should catch up to that, but people didn't like it. But I'm not having that thought process when I see this spine, which I think just goes to show that the urgency is pretty well gone. So we'll see what happens. It's not going anywhere right now, but if it continues to sit, that might be a problem. So, of the 6 books that I brought into my library in June of 2020, I've read 3, a 50% result. We're always going to be happy about that. And I haven't unhauled any at this time, which is also something we will always be happy about. Now let's go back in time to June of 2020, which has, and in typical style, 2019, I'm sorry, did I say 2020? It's June of 2019, and that was my first full year on BookTube. Most of my book hauls from that year are fairly large. The largest in my book haul revisits, unless last year, some of my book hauls got pretty large because I expanded my library with the help of Joel. So, but June of 2019 tends to be the largest. And that is the case with this one because it was my first year on BookTube. I got really excited about all the things and purchased a lot of books. And they're also the most hit or miss book hauls because I was so excited that I was just purchasing things without really thinking about whether or not I wanted to read them or would end up reading them or if I wanted to listen to them on audio instead. Let's see how this one goes. First was The Stonewall Reader, edited by the New York Public Library. I did read this. I did this as a buddy read with someone. My very first buddy read ever was The Stonewall Reader, which is a great book. I think the first 2 sections are the best, just really quickly, because the first section is the pre-Stonewall era. It has a bunch of collected writings from the pre-Stonewall era. And then the second section is a collection of writings that take place during the Stonewall riots. And then the post-Stonewall era is the third section. And for some reason, I feel like it lost all of its momentum. And it feels like it kind of wanted to avoid the AIDS epidemic. And that feels like an odd choice. However, I would still absolutely recommend it. I think it's essential reading for anybody, and it's perfect Pride Month reading. Then there was You Will Be Safe Here by Damien Barr. I do still want to read this book. I don't know when I will ever get around to it, but I do still want to read it. Obviously, I have not read it yet, but I still hope to. There is still hope. Then we have On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. I did read this book. I feel like I need to reread it again at some point because I feel like a lot of people who have very similar taste in books to me have read this and loved it a lot more than I did. I thought it was just okay. So I feel like I might need to go back. I listened to the audio the first time around and maybe print would go better. Maybe I should try it that way at some point. So it's not that long of a book, so it shouldn't be too hard, but we'll see. And then for our purposes here today, I have read it. Then there's Ask Again Yes by Mary Beth Keane. I did read this and I liked it. I admit, though, I think I'm going to unhaul it because I don't think I'm going to reread it. And I just also noticed I haven't talked about it. It's not one of the books that I read and really liked that I continue talking about and recommending, like My Beloved, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. So I don't know. I might get rid of this. I'm going to think about it a little bit. But it might be going away. Not because I didn't like it. I did like it. But just because I don't know that I need to hold it in my library, being honest. Then there's Circe by Madeline Miller. I have not read this. I did read Song of Achilles. I listened to that one on audio, and I thought it was just okay. So that's the reason I haven't gotten to this. I feel like when I was just okay on the Song of Achilles, I have been putting this one off. And people have commented to say that they like Circe more. Some people like Song of Achilles more, but I'll get to it at some point. I don't have any plans to get rid of it. I would still like to try it, but I admit the urgency kind of quieted down once I read the Song of Achilles, but it's not going anywhere. Not going anywhere. Then there was Dark Places by Gillian Flynn. I haven't really been reading mysteries or thrillers, so I unhauled that one. And it is what it is. I also figured if I was going to read Dark Places, it probably would be on audio, so no reason for me to, hold up a spot in my library waiting for it. I found A Complicated Kindness by Miriam Taves in my library for sale, so I grabbed it and have not read it. I have read three Miriam Taves books at this point, and I loved one of them, really liked one of them, and didn't really like the third. I would still like to go back and read A Complicated Kindness. I have not yet, but someday. It's not going anywhere right now. Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles is the final book in this book haul revisit. I have not read it. It is a brick of a book, and because it's so large and because it was taking me such a long time to get to it, and because I do feel like I'd be more likely to read this on audio, I have thought about getting rid of it, and the comments on that pulled me back. So I'm going to hold on to it because a lot of people seem to think it is something that I would really like, and I don't want to get rid of it and then listen to it on audio and want it back in my library. So I'm going to hold on to it at least until I listen to the audio. We'll see when I have eventually or finally get to it. Hopefully soon, maybe, I don't know, but I have not gotten to it yet. So in June of 2019, I brought 8 books into my library. I've read 3, which is 37.5%. I've unhauled 1, which is 12%. 12.5%, technically. In all, I brought 31 books into my library over the last 5 Junes, and I've read 12.5 of them. That's 40.3%. And I feel like that is pretty consistently where I'm at with my book haul revisits. I'm usually somewhere around the 40 to 45% range when it comes to the number of the books that I have read, which is not bad. I'd love it to be 50% or higher. At least I'm consistent, I guess. It is what it is. And I've unhauled 5 out of the 31, which is 16%, and that's not bad. There are a couple that are sort of on the bubble. We'll see. If you have thoughts about any of the books I've talked about or recommendations based on my interest in any of these books, let me know in the comment section down below. If you'd like to make a case for any of the books that I have not read yet or mentioned that I might be getting rid of, let me know in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.